This is Politics UK. I'm Leila Nathoo. Hello and welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Alicia McCarthy. On the programme this week, the government promises a serious package of fundamental reforms after net migration into the UK hits 750,000 people.
It's crystal clear that we need to reduce the numbers significantly by bringing forward further measures to control and to reduce the number of people coming here.
The immigration minister's complaining today, but he's going to be furious when he discovers who's been in charge of the immigration system for the last 13 years.
A new row erupts over the Parthenon sculptures. Keir Starmer criticises Rishi Sunak for cancelling a meeting with the Prime Minister of Greece.
Never mind the British Museum, it's the Prime Minister who's obviously lost his marbles.
When it was clear that the purpose of a meeting was not to discuss substantive issues for the future, but rather to grandstand and relitigate issues of the past, it wasn't appropriate.
HSBC is criticised in Wales for announcing the closure of its Welsh language helpline.
We have a line that is significantly underutilised for the Welsh language service.
Telling me that I've got to wait 3 days to speak my language in my country, frankly, isn't the service that is going to be used or that I would tolerate.
And the former boss of Wilko faces accusations that excessive profit-taking contributed to the firm's collapse.
Could you tell the committee, did your greed bankrupt Wilko?
I don't believe so, no.
Well, here in Westminster, the issue of immigration dominated the week after new figures were released showing net migration at an all-time high. The Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, told the House of Commons people were sick of talk and he would introduce fundamental reforms to address the issue once and for all. Alicia, a bit of a bold promise there from the Immigration Minister. How does he propose to go about doing that?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. So let's just be clear here exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about net migration. Now, that's the difference between the number of people arriving in the UK and the number of people leaving. And the most recent figures for that were a whopping 750,000, and that is a record high. So the government says it is determined to do something about this. Now, Rishi Sunak says he has already introduced some proposals. So, for example, there'll be a limit on the number of dependents you can bring with you if you're a student, and that's due to come in next year. They've also raised the price of getting some visas, so that's going to come in too. But there has been talk of a bit of a split in government, because what's happened is the Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, is said to have introduced his own ideas or put forward his own ideas to be considered. Now, those include things like raising the minimum amount you have to earn to get a work visa, or perhaps limiting the number of visas for things like getting a job in health and social care. And obviously that's really controversial because we need lots of people to come in and do those jobs. And also he's suggesting that perhaps we should get rid of a thing called the shortage occupation list. Now, this allows you to come into the UK to do certain jobs and be paid a little bit less for it. So all of that came up in the Commons on Tuesday, and Labour asked for a minister to come along and explain what was happening. And Robert Jenrick set out exactly what the government was doing to try to get those legal migration numbers down.
Earlier this year, we took action to tackle an unforeseen and substantial rise in the number of students bringing dependents into the UK to roughly 150,000. This means that from courses starting in January, students on taught postgraduate courses will no longer have the ability to bring dependents. Only students on designated postgraduate research programmes will be able to bring those dependents. This will have a tangible effect on net migration. But, Mr. Speaker, it's crystal clear that we need to reduce the numbers significantly by bringing forward further measures to control and to reduce the number of people coming here, and separately to stop the abuse and exploitation of our visa system by companies and individuals.
In practice, dependents of the kind he described bring more economic costs than benefits. So will he immediately introduce measures which restrict the number of dependents that can come here? And will he recognise in doing so that we are relying on him to sort this out? Because we know that he shares our concern that it's time for British workers for British jobs.
Mr. Speaker, now the people in Ashfield have had enough of this. 7,000 people on the council house waiting list. People struggling to get a GP appointment. People struggling to get a dental appointment. Struggling to get school places. Isn't it about time, Minister, that we had a cap on migration and put some clear divide between us and that lot over there?
Well, Mr. Speaker, where's the Home Secretary? And what on earth is going on? Because the media were briefed he was going to make a statement on net migration yesterday or today, but nothing, and he's nowhere. The immigration minister's complaining today, but he's going to be furious when he discovers who's been in charge of the immigration system for the last 13 years. Net migration should come down. Immigration's important for Britain and always will be, but the system needs to be properly controlled and managed so it's fair and effective and is properly linked to the economy.
The Right Honourable Lady has spent her entire political career campaigning for uncontrolled migration. She's campaigned for freedom of movement. She backed a leader of the opposition who campaigned for freedom of movement. She has always supported and lobbied and campaigned for unfettered access to the United Kingdom.
The CBI have said that 2/3 of UK businesses have been hit by labour shortages in the last year. Pressures on services are helped by those people coming here, not hindered. Those pressures on services come about as the result of over 10 years of austerity from the Conservatives. Underinvestment in these services is not the fault of immigrants, it's the fault of this government.
She knows, with respect to illegal migration and asylum seekers, the fine words that she says here in the Chamber are not matched by the actions of the SNP Scottish Government. In fact, to take the city of Edinburgh as one simple example, there in June were fewer asylum seekers in the entire city of Edinburgh than in a single hotel in my honourable friend's constituency in Stoke-on-Trent.
The Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, clearly frustrated himself that the government hasn't managed to do more on this. But interestingly, Labour think this is quite fertile ground for them because the issue also came up at Prime Minister's questions, didn't it?
Yes, it did. But before I tell you about that, we have to talk about a completely different row, and that's about the Parthenon sculptures or the Elgin marbles. Now, why, you might quite reasonably ask, have I got to talk to you about this? This is because Rishi Sunak was due to have a meeting with the Greek Prime Minister, who was in the UK for a couple of days, and he cancelled that meeting at the last minute. And the reason he did that was because the Greek Prime Minister had given an interview with the BBC where he said, we want the Parthenon sculptures back. Rishi Sunak said, that wasn't what we were due to talk about, and cancelled that meeting. So that's the whole backdrop that's going on, bubbling away in the background when we get to Prime Minister's questions. The substance of what Keir Starmer wants to talk about, as you rightly say, is those migration figures that we've just been hearing about in those last couple of clips and the record number of people coming legally to the United Kingdom. There's also, of course, the issue of illegal migration and the people coming to the UK on those small boats, particularly across the Channel. Now, the government's very keen to stop that, but its Rwanda plan, the idea that it will send those people to Rwanda to have their cases assessed there, that has been ruled unlawful by the Supreme Court. Now, the government's reaction to that is that it wants a beefed-up treaty with Rwanda. It also wants to get a bit of emergency legislation through Parliament to see if it can't assuage the concerns that the judges had about sending people to Rwanda. We've had no details of that yet, but that is what the government has said it wants to do. So all of that was going on, and Keir Starmer had plenty to talk about at Prime Minister's questions, and in essence accused the government of being in a big old mess about the whole thing.
In an effort to hide from his failures, the Prime Minister spent this week arguing about an ancient relic that only a tiny minority of the British public have any interest in. Mr. Speaker, that's enough about the Tory party. In 2019, they all promised the country that they would control immigration. Numbers will come down. The British people will be in control. How's it going?
The levels of migration are far too high, and I'm determined to bring them back down to sustainable levels. That's why we've asked the Migration Advisory Council to review certain elements of the system. We're reviewing those findings and we'll bring forward next steps. But earlier this year, we announced the toughest action ever taken to reduce legal migration. The effects of that action are yet to be felt, but will impact 150,000 student dependents, and forecasts show that migration is likely to drop as a result. But all we've heard up until this moment from the Honourable Gentleman on this topic is a secret backroom deal with the EU that would see an additional 100,000 migrants here every year.
Mr. Speaker, never mind the British Museum, it's the Prime Minister who's obviously lost his marbles. Mr. Speaker, the Greek Prime Minister came to London to meet him, a fellow NATO member, an economic ally, one of our most important partners in tackling illegal immigration. But instead of using that meeting to discuss those serious issues, he tried to humiliate him and cancelled at the last minute. Why such small politics, Prime Minister?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, of course, we're always happy to discuss important topics of substance with our allies, like tackling illegal migration or indeed strengthening our security. But when it was clear that the purpose of a meeting was not to discuss substantive issues for the future, but rather to grandstand and relitigate issues of the past, it wasn't appropriate.
Under this government, a bricklayer from overseas can be paid £2,500 less than somebody who's already here. A plasterer, £3,000 less. An engineer, £6,000 less. The list goes on. It's absurd. Labour would scrap his perverse wage-cutting policy. Why won't he?
Mr. Speaker, as I said, we have taken significant measures and will bring forward more. And indeed, as the ONS themselves said, more recent estimates indicate a slowing of immigration as a result of the things that we're doing.
It is ironic that he's suddenly taken such a keen interest in Greek culture when he's clearly become the man with the reverse Midas touch. Everything he touches turns to... maybe the Home Secretary could help me out here. Rubbish. So will the Prime Minister do the country a favour? We'll have to check the tape again, Mr. Speaker, I think. So will the Prime Minister do the country a favour, warn us what he's planning next, so we can prepare ourselves for the disaster that will inevitably follow?
Mr. Speaker, at the beginning of the year, we said we would halve inflation, and this government has delivered, easing the burden on the cost of living for families everywhere. But we know his plans, Mr. Speaker, all the way through that. What did he do? Back inflationary pay rises. He talked about welfare, no controls for welfare, and borrowing £28 billion a year that would just make the situation worse. He mentioned tax, Mr. Speaker. Just this past week, we've delivered the biggest tax cuts since the 1980s for millions of people and businesses, increased pensions and benefits, and this week secured £30 billion of new investment for this country.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, in good news for kids this morning, it was snowing in Aberdeen, and when they looked out of the kitchen window, they would have been filled with delight. But for their parents, many of them who looked out the kitchen window this morning would have been filled with dread. Dread knowing that they simply can't afford to pay their energy bills. So in that context, can I ask the Prime Minister, does he regret offering no financial mechanism whatsoever towards families this winter?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, that's simply not right to say that there isn't support for families this winter. There's been considerable support this year for energy bills, and this winter pensioner households, for example, will receive up to £300 alongside their winter fuel payment, because they're some of the most vulnerable households, and it's right that they get that support at a difficult time.
Particularly lively Prime Minister's questions there. Fair few gags from the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer. Alicia, thank you very much for the moment. We will be back with you shortly. But to Edinburgh now, and our Scotland political reporter, Jenny Davidson, who's at the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood. Jenny, the Scottish Government has pushed back its plan to start phasing out fossil fuel boilers. Why is that?
Well, that's right, and it comes in a week that the First Minister's away at the COP28 climate summit, but back here at Holyrood this week, the Net Zero Homes Minister, Patrick Harvey, announced a change to the date when fossil fuel boilers, new and replacement fossil fuel boilers, will be phased out. Previously, in off-grid properties, the plan had been to end that from 2025, and in properties connected to the gas mains from 2030. But he announced a single new date of 2028 for all properties, saying that would be fairer and clearer, and then a backstop date of 2045 when all homes in Scotland will have to be moved to green heating systems. Now, opposition parties questioned, of course, how much this would cost homeowners and how the estimated 33 million total cost, and it's probably more than that now with inflation because that's a 2021 figure, how that cost would be met.
The opportunity to free people from dependence on fossil fuels and the volatile prices which drive fuel poverty, and to free the world from reliance on the brutal and authoritarian regimes which control so much of the global fossil fuel market. That's why I'm publishing today consultations on proposals which, if Parliament approves, will give the leadership and clarity Scotland needs to make the transition to clean heat by 2045.
For homeowners in Scotland, today will mark the start of a 10-year time bomb for over half of Scotland's homeowners. SNP and Green ministers have come to the Chamber today with a timescale, but not a plan on how they will achieve what they are set out. And there is absolutely nothing in this statement today to provide reassurances that SNP and Green ministers actually understand the true costs that will face homeowners the length and breadth of Scotland.
Timescales for action are already slipping since the first heat and building strategy was published. Why is it taking 2 years as people need to have homes now that are affordable to heat and power? We've been told £33 billion is needed from that strategy, so where's the money coming from? Minister, people don't need warm words, they need warm homes, and they need Scottish Government leadership.
So questions around this, and then alongside that there's also requirements for improvements in energy efficiency in homes, but no change to those dates, 2028 for privately rented homes, 2033 for owner-occupied homes.
And Jenny, behaviour in schools was also a big theme this week, wasn't it? There was a new report showing a worrying rise in behaviour problems.
That's right. The Behaviour in Scottish Schools research report was published this week, and it found rises in all sorts of behaviour problems since 2016. Now, a lot of this was low-level disruption, things like people's chatting, using their phones, but there were also increases in things like aggression and violence between pupils and physical aggression and violence towards school staff. Now, the research found that around a third of staff had experienced verbal aggression within the last week, and 11% some kind of physical violence towards them or a fellow member of staff. Now, this has been an ongoing issue. It's been raised by teaching unions following research by them that's found similar concerns around pupil violence towards teachers. There's been a number of behaviour summits chaired by the Education Secretary. She chaired another one this week, and following that she made a statement to Parliament.
We have to commit for a plan for improvement. The status quo is not an option. Presiding Officer, Scotland's schools are not run by me as Cabinet Secretary, and nor would I wish it to be so. It is imperative, therefore, that local authorities are engaged in the action required to improve behaviour and relationships in Scotland's schools. The report mentions lack of support from some local authorities and disparate approaches to behaviour management policies. To that end, we will develop a national action plan to set out the parameters to improve behaviour and support better relationships in Scotland's schools. The plan will include a range of practical suggestions and solutions.
Many listening will be concerned at what amounts to plenty of talk, but precious few solutions. There's still no new specific guidance for school staff. There's no review of exclusions policies, as many stakeholders have called for, and there's no plan for dealing with attendance issues.
Can't hide my disappointment today. I feel teachers will feel blamed, parents will feel sidelined and pupils could feel abandoned. Many of the issues mentioned have been known for a long time, and so I imagine school staff, pupils and parents will be wondering why the announcement today is for the development of a plan rather than a plan. I'm therefore deeply concerned that not only does the £900,000 announced suggest the problem is in staff training, but that it is unlikely to scratch the surface of investment needed. At a time when leadership's needed, today's statement feels a bit like the Cabinet Secretary believes she's a bystander.
Now, opposition parties, they're questioning the lack of a plan and whether the funding announced would be enough. And a similar reaction from Scotland's biggest teaching union, the EIS, who commented that there wasn't a great deal of detail on the practical steps to be taken, and suggesting that the £900,000 of funding, which would be less than £30,000 per council, won't nearly touch the sides.
And Jenny, we've had First Minister's questions, which were taken this week by the Deputy First Minister, but the row deepened over the Scottish Health Secretary's huge mobile data bill. Talk us through the latest.
Well, yes, this has been continuing for several weeks now and coming up repeatedly at First Minister's questions. Now, this is about the Health Secretary, Michael Matheson, having run up a nearly £11,000 roaming charge on his Parliament iPad on a family holiday to Morocco. He's going to pay back that money. The Scottish Parliament corporate body is looking into the original expense, but the Scottish Conservatives continuing to challenge over the issue of honesty and trust about not the money itself, but the statements made by Michael Matheson about that. And this week it comes on the back of a poll by Ipsos Mori suggesting that 61% of the Scottish public think Michael Matheson should resign. The Scottish Conservatives suggesting, again, he should go. But Deputy First Minister Shona Robeson saying, actually, Douglas Ross should be talking about the autumn statement. He should be talking about Scotland's public finances, public services and things like the NHS instead.
The problem for the SNP government is the public don't believe Michael Matheson. Yeah. A poll yesterday showed the vast majority of Scots believe he should stand down, and that included a majority of SNP voters who believe Michael Matheson needs to go. Now, they can see he's not focused on the day job. In the middle of an NHS crisis, the public need to trust the Health Secretary. They don't. Nurses and doctors, when they meet him, need to know that he's honest. He's not. The Health Secretary has lost the confidence of the country, and he needs to go for the good of our NHS. This week, the Deputy First Minister said the public sector workforce would need to shrink. Shouldn't that start with sacking Michael Matheson?
Deputy First Minister. Well, of course, what Douglas Ross didn't refer to in the poll was that 72% were dissatisfied with Rishi Sunak's performance as the Prime Minister, and of course 54% of people support independence for Scotland. In terms of Michael Matheson getting on with the job, Michael Matheson is getting on with the job of being Health Secretary, ahead of what, of course, is expected to be a challenging winter for the Health Service. If Douglas Ross cared anything about the NHS, he would be objecting to the fact that next year only £10.8 million has been given to the NHS from the UK Tory government.
And all this comes in a week where concerns have been raised about the public sector and possible cuts to the public sector in Scotland. Shona Robeson earlier in the week on the Sunday show saying that there would need to be some cuts to public sector. Police warning that they can't take any more cuts. And the former chief executive of the NHS in Scotland, Paul Gray, talking this week about how the NHS is unsustainable in its current form. So a lot of concerns about that as the NHS goes into winter.
Jenny Davidson at Holyrood, thanks very much indeed. Well, back in Westminster, and the government has been challenged to guarantee continuing military funding for Ukraine after Labour pointed out that this year's £2.3 billion budget runs out in March. Alicia, do we really think that this is something that is in doubt?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, the war in Ukraine has been rather overshadowed by events in the Middle East in recent weeks, but the war does rumble on. Boris Johnson, you'll remember, was extremely bullish about helping Ukraine. So there was sanctions on Russia, there was humanitarian help. And according to the House of Commons Library, the government's already provided over $4.5 billion in military assistance and committed to match that in 2023. And that's taken all sorts of forms. So there's a training programme, for example, for Ukrainian military personnel to come to the UK and have some training. There's training for fast jet pilots, which is going to come in. So the British government has been doing all sorts of things as well as providing that financial help. The concern among many MPs is that when the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, gave his autumn statement just a week or so ago, there was no mention about the future budget for Ukraine. And so Labour wanted to know basically what was going on.
The Defence Secretary said last month, let's not forget about Ukraine. So why did the autumn statement do just that? No 2024 military funding for Ukraine, no 2024 action plan for Ukraine. At the very time when Ukraine needs confidence that it has strong, continuing support from allies, the Prime Minister is stepping back. UK leadership on Ukraine is flagging.
All the way through, Mr. Speaker, the thing that the UK has done better than anybody else in the world is understood what the Ukrainians want to do next and got there first in terms of delivering that capability and in so doing emboldening others to follow.
Where does the Minister think that industry, Ukrainians and British service personnel should look for comfort given the silence in the autumn statement on the subject of continued UK support for Ukraine?
The Ukrainians know what they are getting this year. And they have seen again and again and again the UK seeking to lead the world and catalyse donations. We've been the first to go through every capability threshold. They know that. They continue to know that.
A lot of pressure there in the Commons for the government to commit to continue supporting Ukraine. But also underway now is the next round of international climate talks, COP28 this time. It's being hosted by the United Arab Emirates, the UAE. We've got the Prime Minister, the King, the Foreign Secretary, all there representing the UK. But Labour are accusing the government of climate hypocrisy.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So this is COP, the Conference of the Parties, as it's really known. This is the United Nations Climate Summit that's held every year so that world leaders can try to find a way to limit global temperature rises. So world leaders, policymakers, activists, they all turn up to these events to try to come up with some ways forward. But back in September, Rishi Sunak did announce a watering down of some of his environmental policies. Now, some people think that that's linked to the Tories' surprise win in the Uxbridge by-election. Now, cast your mind back. There was a by-election in the seat of Uxbridge and the Tories campaigned very heavily against a thing called ULEZ. Now, this is a clean air zone that the Mayor of London wants to introduce and is introducing across the capital. The Tories campaigned against that and they credit their victory in that seat in no small measure to that campaign. Now, a short while later, Rishi Sunak then announced that there were broader environmental measures that he was going to have another think about. So that was things like delaying the ban on selling petrol and diesel cars. That's being pushed back to 2035. There were some changes to the phasing out of fossil fuel boilers that he announced as well. And he also announced a change so that landlords wouldn't have to improve the energy efficiency of their properties in quite the same way and quite as fast as they were going to have to do under original plans. Now, Rishi Sunak insists that despite all of that, he is still very much committed to net zero, as it's known, by 2050. But he has come in for a lot of criticism, including from someone called Lord Stern. Now, Lord Stern is an economist, and he's previously written a report about how we need to urgently protect the environment. So when all this came up in the Commons, Labour MPs challenged the government over those changes.
He seems to meet with so many business leaders, he must have heard the shock and horror about the government's rollbacks when it comes to net zero. Because earlier this month, the Aviva CEO, Amanda Blank, said the government was putting our climate goals as a country, and I quote, under threat, putting at risk jobs, growth and the additional investment the UK requires. She's not wrong, is she?
Well, the honourable gentleman has a well-founded and highly esteemed reputation for anger. I would point out to him, though, that this country under this government has cut its emissions more than any other major economy on the planet, has the most ambitious plans for 2030.
Mr. Speaker, the world sorely needs leadership at COP28, but the verdict of our most globally respected climate expert, Lord Stern, earlier this month was damning, and I quote, "The government's backsliding on climate action is a deeply damaging mistake, damaging for the UK, the world and the future of us all." Would you like to take this opportunity to place on record her response to Lord Stern?
Well, the right honourable gentleman should understand that we have the most ambitious climate targets of any of our international peers. If you look at the delivery to date, we overshot on Carbon Budget 1, Carbon Budget 2, we're on track to overshoot on Carbon Budget 3. In fact, the UN GAP report showed just last week that the UK is expected to reduce emissions at the fastest rate between 2015 and 2030 of any of the G20 group.
Mr. Speaker, she has no response to Lord Stern, and the problem is he sees a government preaching one thing and doing another. So her negotiators will argue at COP to phase out fossil fuels, but she wants to drill every last drop at home and open new coal mines. She will tell developing countries climate action is good for the economy, but the government uses climate delay to try and divide people here at home. Doesn't she realise that climate hypocrisy just trashes our reputation and undermines our leadership?
Well, I completely reject that characterisation. At COP28, we will be talking about the UK's leadership when it comes to cutting climate change emissions. We have cut emissions more than any of our international peers by 1990. Even if you look forward to our targets to 2030, we still will be cutting emissions more than any of our international peers. That is something that I think the right honourable gentleman will be well to welcome.
Given the UK's decline under this government to 7th place behind the US and Germany in attracting green investment, as per EY's analysis, what urgent steps is the Secretary of State taking to boost our competitiveness in green industries?
The hypocrisy and the ignorance coming from the party opposite is extraordinary. We've decarbonised more than any major economy on this earth, and we will decarbonise more to 2030. And we're doing it by unlocking a level of investment into renewable energy double that you've seen in the United States. So take the selective facts and put them where the sun don't shine.
I think we've had a few problems with language already, and I'm sure the Minister will think carefully before he answers again.
Clearly a very passionate exchange there on the government's environmental record. Alicia, we will be back with you before the end of the programme, but many thanks for now. But to Cardiff and our Wales political reporter, Cemlyn Davies, who's at the Senedd. Cemlyn, Senedd members have been questioning a senior executive from HSBC this week over the bank's decision to scrap its Welsh language phone line. Why is it being closed?
Yeah, that's right. And when that decision by HSBC was announced some 3 weeks ago, it sparked fierce criticism from across the Senedd. And this week, the Senedd's Culture Committee had an opportunity, as you say, to discuss the matter with a representative from the bank. And he explained to them that the lack of calls to that Welsh language helpline meant that it simply wasn't sustainable.
We have a line that is significantly underutilized for the Welsh language service. We get about 22 calls a day. This line is operated by 3 colleagues at HSBC. So they, between them, they are getting, about seven calls on a day.
Well, Mr Carvalho said that only 6% of the calls to the Welsh language helpline are actually handled in Welsh, because the 3 Welsh-speaking call handlers that the bank employs also handle calls in English, and so they're often not available when a call comes in on the Welsh language phone line. So that line will go in the new year, but it will be replaced with a service where customers will be able to request a Welsh language callback within 3 days. And Mr Carvalho said that would mean that the new service would be better than what's currently on offer, because they'd be able to guarantee that somebody wanting to have a Welsh language conversation would be able to have a call back in Welsh. But the committee's members weren't convinced by that.
telling us we can have a call back in 3 days is inadequate. It's simply inadequate. That's not how we live our lives. You know, my relationship quite often with my daughter is, you know, she phones me in the morning and she wants cash by the afternoon. You know, I can do that through the app. Telling me that I've got to wait 3 days to speak my language in my country, frankly, isn't the service that is going to be used or that I would tolerate myself. My constituents expect better than that.
If somebody's expecting a phone call anytime over 3 days, they're not going to be carrying paperwork around with them for 3 days for them to refer to, so that's an issue as well. So in that moment in time when they need to speak to the bank, they might have to have, you know, the information there and they're prepared. But if it could be any time over 3 days, that's massive. If it's over 2 days, it might be slightly better.
HSBC's words, we were born speaking different languages. We were born speaking different languages in Wales, and we are still living speaking different languages, and we really need, and people who are vulnerable in Wales, and people who, not just people who just want to make a point about speaking Welsh, but people who live their lives through the medium of Welsh, cannot be expected to wait for 3 days in order to continue with their lives.
Well, Mr Carvalho told the committee that HSBC would review the situation after the first 3 months of next year.
We could get some movement there. And Cemlyn, the Welsh Government's forthcoming budget announcement was also discussed this week. What do we think is going to be in it?
Yes, that's right. Ministers will set out their spending plans for next year in a few weeks' time when the draft budget is published. They've already warned, of course, that money is tight. And so what we're seeing at the moment is various sectors and organisations trying to get in there early, making the case for their policy area and for funding for their policy area to be protected. This week we've heard calls from the farming sector and from farming unions saying that the rural affairs pot needs to be protected, and Plaid Cymru's leader, Rhina Piorwerth, asked the First Minister, Labour's Mark Drakeford, this week if he could give farmers that assurance. Well, the First Minister said no, he couldn't.
We are £1.3 billion short of what we need next year. That is the impact of inflation and the failure of the UK government to sustain the real worth of the budget they said we needed when the Comprehensive Spending Review set our budgets for 3 years. If you have to find £1.3 billion worth of activity to live within our means, then no single part of the Welsh Government can regard itself as immune from that effort, and that includes agriculture, as it includes everything else we do.
Well, Rhina Piorwerth responded to the First Minister, saying that spending on farming should be seen as an investment. Mr Drakeford said he agreed with that, but that spending on education, housing, transport and health is also an investment. So some very difficult decisions for the Welsh Government to make over the next few weeks before that draft budget is announced.
And just finally, Cemlyn, we've also had ministers being questioned over a delay to a scheme aimed at improving the energy efficiency of Welsh homes. Why has that been held up?
Yes, this is the new Warm Homes scheme, which will provide help and advice to those needing to make their homes more energy efficient. It was due to come into force last April, but it now seems as though it'll be delayed until next spring, after the coldest part of the year has passed, and that's drawn criticism from opposition parties.
That will leave thousands of households cold throughout the winter in fuel poverty or pushed further into debt because of heating costs and low energy efficiency. I know, Minister, that you won't be happy about the fact that that's happening, but through delaying, this is condemning people to the cold, isn't it, with disastrous effects for human health and well-being, household budgets and the environment. So could you tell us, please, when exactly we can expect the rollout of the new Warm Homes programme, and could you tell us why it's being delayed until the spring, please?
So it's actually out to tender at the moment, and it just depends who wins it. If the person who wins it is able to start immediately, then we'll start immediately. If the person who wins it needs a ramp-up time, we'll have to take that into account. That will be part of the tender process.
Well, the Minister explained that the delay in bringing this new scheme into force was down to changes to the procurement process post-Brexit, and she also said that the current scheme has been extended until March in order to bridge the gap.
Kemlyn Davis, many thanks indeed for bringing us up to date from Cardiff Bay. Now, Wilko was a mainstay of the high street, selling everything from groceries to gardening supplies and stationery until it went bust in August with the loss of thousands of jobs. This week, the former boss appeared before a parliamentary committee to answer questions about her responsibility for the company's collapse. Alicia, what was the line of questioning to her?
Yeah, well, as you say, Wilko was this high street staple that had been in business for more than 90 years. Lisa Wilkinson, the granddaughter of the founder, was in front of this committee. And they asked her what went wrong, what happened to the firm. And she had a long list of things that had gone wrong, everything from long leases to expensive high street stores, the impact of COVID, even Liz Truss's mini budget, which hiked interest rates just as they were renegotiating a lending deal. Now, she said she was devastated. She said that she was sorry, but that didn't stop her being on the receiving end of some pretty blunt questions from MPs.
Ms Wilkinson, perhaps I could start with you. Could you tell the committee, did your greed bankrupt Wilko?
I don't believe so, no.
We have a pension fund deficit of over £50 million, and we have creditors who are at best going to see 4p in the pound on the debts that Wilko owes to them. Do you want to just take this moment to apologise to those workers who are facing Christmas without work?
So I am thankful to so many people for so many things that they have done to help Wilko, not least amongst those the fantastic team members that have always worked at Wilko, the amazing suppliers and advisors who have supported us, and of course, top of that list has got to be the fantastic customers who shopped with us for over 90 years in our stores. I am devastated that we have let each and every one of those people down with the insolvency that Wilko has done. I don't know how to put into words how sad I am that we have let down all our customers, all our team members, our suppliers, our advisors. Genuinely, I don't know what you want me to say, but I have always gone on record.
Sorry was the one word I was looking for, which
you
I
can
didn't
have
hear.
the word sorry, of course. I'm sorry if you wish me to say the word sorry.
I wanted just to give you that opportunity.
No, I thought devastated covered it. I apologise. I wasn't trying to be clever. I am sorry that we are not there supporting all those people anymore.
Let me just wrap up this point with a question about the profitability between 2019 and 2022. The profits for that period of time was £11.6 million. The dividends that were paid out over that time was £7.5 million. That's two-thirds. Two-thirds of the profits of a company that was in trouble were paid out in dividends. How on earth can that be justified?
So I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I don't recognise that time period. I'm not disputing it at all, but I don't recognise the time period. In the 9 years since the demerger, we have taken out the shareholders have had about £15 million worth of dividends, which is about 1.7 million per year. Each of those dividends would have followed the correct corporate governance. They would have been recommended by the CFO as prudent. They would have gone through the boards of directors.
The Wilkinson family is among the wealthiest families in the country, thanks to the Wilko business over 90 years. As things stand, there's a £50 million hole in the Wilko pension fund. Shouldn't the family be making good that hole so that at least the full pensions owed to people are paid?
I don't recognise that statement that we are one of the wealthiest families in the country, and I don't have assets to fill a £50 million hole in a pension scheme. I don't.
A lot of interest there in why Wilko collapsed and what is going to happen now. Alicia, thank you so much for being with us today. That is all for Politics UK this week. Politics Live will be back on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and on iPlayer. But from us, goodbye.